Well, children, after studying this module, you shall be able to understand the role of government in an economy. You will be able to know the position of classicals and Keynesians on fiscal policy. Also, be familiar with the evolution, objectives, tools and relevance of fiscal policy. And last but not the least, you will be able to understand several concepts relating to budgets such as revenue deficit, primary deficit, fiscal deficit. Now I will give you a brief introduction of the module. Well guys, you know that government is an important player in an economy and also it has a special role to play in all economies. The government is expected to spend on wide variety of goods and services, plus create and maintain infrastructure such as roads, highways, public transport, for example subway, etc. And also it provides benefits such as defense, pension, health and medical services, education, etc. Well, its role through government spending, that is G, transfers, that is TR, and taxation, that is T, was a significant component of Keynesian analysis. See, T and TR are similar in the sense that both these are controlled by policy makers and hence these are policy variables. The difference among them is that while G is an exogenous or autonomous means independent of income, tax revenue and transfer payments typically depend upon the level of income. This module discusses aspects of government expenditure and sources of government revenue, introducing several important concepts such as fiscal deficit, primary deficit and government debt. It also outlines the objectives, tools and instruments of fiscal policy. After introducing these concepts in the present module, the next module will discuss the trends and behavior of some of these variables in the context of India. But guys, before we begin that, the subsequent section brings out the role of government in an economy by presenting the classical and Keynesian school of thought. Now we will look at the role of government versus market mechanism. The capitalist economies believe in laissez-faire, that literally means let be. In such market economies, individuals are free to hold private property, production is carried on for profit motive, and invisible forces of demand and supply in the market set prices and determine all economic activities. In such economies, there is little role for state except for maintaining law and order. The classical economists believe in free market economies and minimal role of the state. However, classical economists fail to provide solution to the problems arising out of the Great Depression. During that time, unemployment kept increasing and falling wages and prices failed to stimulate demand and restore full employment. The Great Depression of the 1930s made economists realize that the classical economic principles of free market economy and Say's law in the bracket that states supply creates its own demand bracket close were ineffective in bringing the economy out of such long spell of unemployment and stagnation. Government intervention was essential to boost the economy from this situation of low growth and high unemployment. It was in this context that Keynesian economics came to the forefront. In the 1930s, in response to the Great Depression, Keynes' policy prescription in his classic, that is the general theory of employment, interest and money, was to raise government spending, which is also called as expansionary fiscal policy. It could raise aggregate demand in an economy. Accordingly, most modern day economies have active government that provide a wide variety of goods and services. However, to attain efficiency, it is essential that the government provides services
that are more efficiently provided by it rather than private sector. The government should provide goods and services in the conditions of market failure. It is a situation when the free market fails to provide optimal quantities of goods and services. In such cases, the government needs to step in to provide such essential goods and services. First case of market failure is externalities. Externalities are third party effects, that is, the effects of an economic decision or activity that falls on parties that are not directly involved in that decision or activity. Externality could be positive or negative. Examples of positive externalities are education, immunization against contagious diseases, etc. Examples of negative externality are pollution emitting out of a factory, passive smoking, etc. In case of externalities, markets fail to provide optimal amount of goods. Generally, in case of negative externality, there would be overproduction, and government would have to intervene to reduce production to optimal levels. This could be done by imposing a tax on polluters. Second case of market failure is public goods. Public goods are characterized by non-excludability and non-rivalry in consumption. For instance, both A and B can enjoy the fresh air in a park, which is a public good, without any rivalry. Also, it would be impossible or very expensive to confine the benefit of the good to selected people. For example, such as only to those paying for it. In contrast, a private good such as an apple is rivalrous as well as excludable. It is characterized by rivalry in consumption. If A consumes, then B would not be able to consume it, and vice versa. Also, the market price excludes the people who are unable to pay for it. In case of public goods, the free market economy fails to provide goods. This is because while all individuals would be willing to enjoy the benefits of public goods, none would be willing to pay for it. The free riders are individuals who would be willing to enjoy the benefits of a public good without paying for it. Hence, due to the problem of free rider, the market fails to provide goods and government would have to provide these goods. Third case of market failure is natural monopolies. Natural monopolies arise when production is most efficient if carried on by a single firm as long run average costs decline over a very large range of output. This is particularly so in the case of industries having high fixed capital costs, especially for public utilities such as electricity and water supply. There are two reasons why government may provide such services. First, these are essential commodities. Second, it is natural for the market to have a monopoly in the production of such services, and monopolies could be exploitative. Fourth case of market failure is low profits or high gestation lags. Sometimes production of a good may not be attractive enough for a private producer. Due to low profits, the good may be produced in less quantity or may not be produced at all. In such cases, market fails to provide goods. It could also happen that some goods or services may provide returns after a long period of time, or alternatively, the investment required may be very high, that is, much beyond the capacity of a private entrepreneur. A private producer may not like to undertake production in all such cases. A government might have to carry on the production in such cases. Apart from these, the government undertakes production with a welfare motive. This is unlike the private sector, which produces goods only for the profit motive. The government provides a safety net to people to care for them during unemployment, retirement, and old age, etc. But since government does not charge individuals according to marginal cost principles, but as to take into account welfare motive, it may be difficult to sustain its expenditure. Now, this raises a relevant question as to how can government finance its debt? We will explore this in the later section. Now we will discuss the tools, instruments, and the relevance of the fiscal policy. Governments use both fiscal and monetary policies to stabilize the output, prices, and rates of interest in the economy. The fiscal policy of the government is the action of the government with regard to government purchases, transfer payments, and taxes. Typically, fiscal policy is conducted by the central government in line with its overall macroeconomic policy stance. In comparison, states and local governments tend to have limited funds at their disposal, and local needs and requirements rather than the macroeconomic goals of the economy determine the expenditure at these lower levels. In what follows, we'll briefly review the evolution of fiscal policy, the types of such policy, its main objectives, tools, and impact. Evolution. Prior to the 1930s, fiscal policy was not as popular as classical economists believed in operation of free markets to solve economic problems and least government interference. The classicals believed that a free market through flexible wage, price, and interest rates would restore equilibrium if the economy deviated from it. Accordingly, government's role was limited in such a classical framework, and so was the relevance of the concept of fiscal deficit. But gradually, especially after the Great Depression, economists started acknowledging the role of fiscal policy. The Great Depression has questioned the classical belief that the free market economy forces would correct any disequilibrium by itself. Keynes maintained that prices and wages are not flexible enough always to result in full employment of resources. He believed that they are often sticky or slow to adjust. Well, in sum, Keynes demonstrated in his analysis that economy could get trapped below its potential level, requiring government intervention to raise aggregate demand, which is denoted by AD, to boost the economy. The use of counter-cyclical fiscal policy is a useful tool for reducing the cyclical fluctuations in the economy. For instance, when the economy is in recession, we can boost the economy through expansionary fiscal policy through raising spending or reducing taxes. Prior to Great Depression, balanced budgets were more popular. But after Keynesian revolution, it was understood that budget deficits are often required to promote stability as well as boost employment. Thus, Keynes emphasized fiscal policy as an effective tool to boost the economy and lift it out of the recession. Economists have maintained that changes in rate of interest have little effect on demand and output when IS curve is very steep. Remember the case of vertical IS curve? In such a case, monetary policy fails to affect output, while fiscal policy has maximum effect on output. The fiscal policy is the policy of the government with regard to taxes, government spending, transfers, and borrowing, and it also attempts to focus on the impact of government intervention on GDP, employment, levels of income and output, price level, and economic growth. Fiscal policies are mainly of two types: automatic stabilizers and discretionary fiscal policy. Automatic stabilizers are the fiscal policy tools, both on revenue and expenditure side, that adjust automatically to cyclical fluctuations in the economy. An automatic stabilizer is a process that assists in reducing the extent of variation in output and that operates automatically in the economy. For example, income tax and unemployment allowances. These stabilizers help in stabilizing the economy. These stimulate AD during recessions and dampen AD during boom period. For example, the net taxes increase during booms as incomes expand or people move into higher tax brackets. This checks the growth in disposable income and hence consumption. This helps to keep a check on inflation in the wake of rising demand. Conversely, during the period of recession, net tax falls. This prevents disposable income and consumption from falling too much, thus acting as an automatic stabilizer. The primary objective of these automatic stabilizers was to work as redistribution programs. They may not eliminate fluctuations but only reduce them. Discretionary fiscal policy, such as one-time increase in capital G, increase in transfer payments, or a decrease in taxes, are at the discretion of the government. These decisions are made based on the broad macroeconomic objectives of wider employment, stable prices, or higher growth. The objectives of fiscal policy are: firstly, maintain low rate of unemployment; second, price stability; and third, raise the rate of economic growth. The tools or instruments of fiscal stabilization policy are government spending, denoted by G, transfers, denoted by TR, and taxation, denoted by T. These were dealt in detail in the earlier module on national income accounting. G consists of the expenditure incurred by the central, state, and local governments on currently produced goods and services. Taxation includes center, states, and local tax revenue receipts. As stated earlier, G is exogenous. The other two are dependent on level of income. The tax revenue is cyclical, that is, rises as income increases. And the transfer payments are counter-cyclical, that is, fall as income rises. The two together imply that net tax revenue, that is, T minus TR, rises as income rises. These two policy variables act as automatic fiscal stabilizers in an economy. These help in stabilization or smoothing of disposable income, consumption, and GDP. The full impact of fiscal policy on output may sometimes be reduced as a result of crowding out. In the extreme case, full crowding out may also take place. Remember that an increase in government spending increases the rate of interest, thereby reducing private investment. The discouraging effect of an increase in government spending on private investment results in increase in output, but not by full extent as would have happened if private investment had remained unchanged. We have discussed crowding out in various cases in modules on fiscal and monetary policy. Hence, one of the factors determining the effectiveness of fiscal policy as a tool of stabilization is the extent of crowding out that is observed in its wake. Another factor is that often there are lags in fiscal policy. That is, substantial time, months, or even years may be required in decision and implementation of fiscal measures. The execution lag may be defined as the time lag between the point when the need for government policy action has been ascertained and the actual execution of this policy decision. These lags could reduce the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Such lags are smaller in the case of monetary policy. In fact, they are almost immediately executed. But in the case of fiscal policy, these lags could be substantial as actions here often may not be taken immediately owing to political economy factors. Now we will discuss some concepts related to budget. Budget deficit and surplus. The budget deficit or fiscal deficit may be defined as the excess of government spending over the revenue in the form of taxes. The issue of budget deficit or surplus has been widely discussed from long time by economists and policymakers. Due to financial constraints, the government is often pressed to reduce its budget deficit. High budget deficits may give rise to several problems. For example, in open economies, they may lead to high current account deficits, and associated problems of financing may lead to mounting external debt. This may result in default on external debt and degrading of the international credit ratings of the country, as has recently been observed in case of Greece. However, raising taxes or cutting spending or subsidies is not considered a politically attractive decision. While budget deficit accounts for not just current spending but also interest payments to be made on the past deficits, the concept of primary deficit does not account for interest payments. The primary deficit can be defined as government expenditure excluding interest payments on national debt less its revenue. Accordingly, primary deficit is also referred to as non-interest deficit. Primary deficit can be stated as total fiscal deficit minus interest payments on government debt. Revenue accounts. The government's budget is broadly composed of two distinct parts, revenue and capital expenditure, and receipts. The revenue budget relates to the current as well as regular receipts and expenditure of the government. These may include items such as defense, subsidies, pension, interest on government debt, grants to states, etc. The revenue receipts can be classified into tax and non-tax revenue. The tax revenue includes receipts from both direct and indirect taxes. The non-tax revenue receipts include earnings from property, land, forest, as well as earnings from departmental undertakings such as railways and postal services. Accordingly, the revenue deficit is computed as revenue deficit is equal to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. The capital budget, on the other hand, relates to expenditure incurred on creation of assets for the country. The capital receipts includes borrowings from the internal and external sources, provident funds, and small savings of public, disinvestment proceeds, and loans and advances made by the government. The interest payments on these borrowings go into revenue expenditure. Balanced budget. Is balanced budget good or bad? According to Keynesians, the budget should be in deficit situation when the economy is in recession. In such a case, reducing tax rate or raising expenditure would boost the economy. But this raises the issue of financing of government debt. Burden of government debt. Just like an individual, governments cannot continuously incur deficits without worrying about how to finance it. Again, similar to any individual, government can finance its deficit by borrowing from internal or external lending sources. However, unlike an individual, government has additional capacity to monetize its debt by creating money. Though government cannot literally print money, it can issue bonds and ask the central bank to buy them. Then the government can use this money to finance its deficit. A large budget deficit may make repayment difficult for the government. This may make it difficult to take fresh loans in future, especially from external sources. In addition, the existing as well as new loans may face higher interest rates. In such a financial constraint, government often has to resort to deficit financing, also referred to as monetization of debt. A high fiscal deficit also restricts the ability to undertake active fiscal policy. With budget deficits rising every year and with consequent rise in interest payments, an important issue that is of concern is that is whether such deficits are sustainable. Just as we compute debt ratio for a firm, we can compute debt ratio for an economy that is calculated as debt to nominal GDP. The ratio of debt to nominal GDP may be more useful than looking at absolute value of debt as it provides an estimate of debt relative to the size of the economy. The principle of intergenerational accounting examines how to allocate debt burden among generations. It evaluates the costs and benefits associated with the fiscal actions bracket start, both taxes and expenditure bracket close, on various age and gender groups in the economy. For instance, a rise in tax or a decline in spending could adversely affect women for whom certain benefits, for example, financed by government programs, might have been withdrawn. Thus, the debate on how large should be the government debt has continuously occupied center stage in policy debates. Some would regard high government deficit as a sign of efficient government working to attain social objectives. At the same time, others may regard a high deficit as inability of the government to keep its expenditure within confined limits, defined by its revenue sources. But most would regard government programs such as national defense, unemployment allowance, and social security programs as essential. In reality, the extent of government spending depends more on political decisions and may be influenced by considerations about vote banks, especially in a democracy. Hence, the policy discussion on the optimal level of government spending and hence government debt remains unresolved.
Let's summarize the discussion we have done so far. The government is expected to spend on a wide variety of goods and services, plus create and maintain infrastructure like roads, ports, railways, power generation, etc. And they also provide benefits such as defense, pension, health and education. Market failure is a situation in which free market fails to provide goods and services and the government steps in to provide them. Also, you know that externalities, public goods, natural monopolies and projects with low profits and high gestation lags are some of the situations in which markets fail. Unlike the private sector that is driven by profit motive, the government undertakes production with a welfare motive. The government's role was limited in the classical economic framework. You see, after the Great Depression, economists began acknowledging the role of fiscal policy. Automatic stabilizers are the fiscal policy tools, both on the revenue and expenditure side, that adjust automatically to cyclical fluctuations in the economy. For example, taxation and unemployment allowances. Discretionary fiscal policy such as one-time increase in the government expenditure, increase in transfer payments or a decrease in taxes are at the discretion of the government. Well, the objectives of fiscal policy are to lower unemployment, attain stable prices and achieve higher economic growth. The tools or instruments of fiscal stabilization policy are government spending, transfers and taxation. The budget deficit or fiscal deficit may be defined as the excess of government spending over the revenues in the form of taxes. Well, you see, the primary deficit can be defined as government expenditure excluding interest payments on national debt less its revenue. The principle of intergenerational accounting examines how to allocate debt burden among generations based on the cost and the benefits associated with fiscal actions. Now, these actions includes what taxes and expenditure, right, on various age and gender groups in an economy.